Good evening, everybody, and good after or late afternoons for those of you tuning in from the Pacific Coast. We're just going to get started here as people trickle in, but my name is Grace Lee, and I'm the Marketing and Communications Coordinator at Field Hockey Canada, and I'm so honored to welcome everybody to the Racism in Sports and Effective Allyship panel. We have some other FHC staff on the line, Kevin Underhill and Haley Yap, who will be helping host this 1-hour session with me. And just a bit of housekeeping before we start. I ask that everybody keeps their mics muted and their cameras off unless instructed to do so by FHC staff. And I also advise that you guys view the session in gallery mode by clicking the top right corner and selecting the hide non-video participants option, just so you can see only myself and our panelists. If you have any question, please write it in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end of the session. And this will be recorded for future use. So we'll also be sending out an exit survey at the end, so please take a few minutes of your time to fill it out if you're able. And if you're counting this session towards your NCCP maintenance, please also indicate that in the survey. Don't forget to download your conference bingo card from the website and fill it along as we go along the conference. And lastly, huge thank you to our sponsors, Griffin Hockey, Osaka Hockey, and Frontline Medical Supply for their support that they've given us. Before we kick things off, I'm hosting the session in Toronto, and I would just like to acknowledge the land that I'm standing on today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I encourage you all to acknowledge your respective lands as well. And without further ado, we would like to welcome Inderpal Sehmbi, the Canadian men's U21 field hockey coach and physical health educator within the Vancouver School Board, Shireen Ahmed, a writer, TEDx speaker, mentor, and award-winning sports activist, and Patrick Tshutshani, Field Hockey Canada's Women's Next Gen Director. So I'll start things off with a very simple and very light question. And you guys can choose whoever goes first, but give us a glimpse of your life up until now. What was your journey like as a sports professional and athlete emerging in the industry? Perhaps we can start with you, Indy, as your mic's unmuted.
Thanks, Grace. Just before we get going, I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Coast Salish peoples. Thanks for having me. I'll keep my intro pretty brief because everybody else is way more interesting than I am. So I started playing hockey at 6 years old in Richmond, BC. Continued playing club hockey up until the age of 14. Started to play provincial level hockey, and then found a real interest in high level hockey, and made the junior national team in '99. I continued on with that team until 2001, and then left for a bit, took a bit of a hiatus, and then came back to train with the senior men's team till 2005. During that journey, I picked up coaching. I had a high school coach that was instrumental in my development in basketball, actually, and she was the one who kind of inspired me to become a coach first before field hockey, and then soon after I began with hockey camps and coaching provincially within my PSO. It all kind of intertwined with my completing of school and becoming a teacher and educator. And then in 2008, after the Olympics, I had the opportunity to become a performance analyst with the women's team. Actually, my good friend Paul Bundy had me work as an analyst there, and then I kind of stumbled into working with national teams, became the junior national team assistant coach in 2011. I went to a couple of senior events, World Cups, Commonwealth Games. 2014, I ended up taking a team to the Youth Olympics, where we got a silver medal, and that kind of parlayed my career into the under 21 and next gen coach. And in 2016, we were able to head to the Junior World Cup. So and that's kind of led me to where I am now. I just finished my master's in high performance coaching and technical leadership.
Great, Shireen or Patrick?
I'll go. Good evening, everyone, wherever you are in the world. My name is Patrick Duchani. current women's next gen head coach. I was born and bred in South Africa in a small little town called Lady Grey. Kind of grew up there and then moved to Johannesburg, where I did my schooling and matriculated from there, and also then studied biomechanics, and then also then got involved with hockey through a really good friend of mine, Adrian Carolyn, who was my varsity coach. And at the time, he was involved in the national setup as a performance analyst. And he said to me, hey, would you like to be interested to see how things work? Kind of took a liking to it. And that's how I got introduced into sort of the international scene. And then, then got involved and coached several junior national teams, from U16s, U18s, U21s. Then was fortunate enough to go to the Junior World Cup in 2009, 2013 and 2016. And then also got to go to the Youth Olympic Games in Nanjing, Commonwealth Games. And then had a stint in Hong Kong as well, in Asia, and then find myself in Canada. So it's been a great journey, and I look forward to continuing this journey. And I think there's lots that still lies ahead.
And last but not least, Shireen.
Thank you. Evening, afternoon, everybody. My name is Shireen Ahmed. And I'm based in Toronto. I was born and raised in Halifax. So I moved to Toronto for university, and I'm actually a soccer player. I played varsity for U of T, but when I was in my second year of university, I decided to wear a headscarf. That what ended up happening in that point is that I just quickly came to know that there wouldn't be any more options for me to play. And that's kind of what propelled my interest in sports writing and sports journalism. Now I'm a multiple platform sports journalist. I co-host a podcast called Burn It All Down, but at the time I wasn't. I had actually studied political science. So it's not where I thought I would go. Life happens. I did frontline work with settlement agencies and survivors of interpersonal and domestic violence and refugee reunification programs. And sport was always a connector. It was always very much a connector of people. If I've traveled anywhere in the world, the one thing I need to do is speak the language of football, and I'm fine, and I can communicate, and it's wonderful. And so that had always motivated me to use sports as a vehicle for change in a positive way without brushing over difficult conversations that need to happen. That sort of led to my career. My career essentially started from a Tumblr blog when I was writing about hijab, kippah, and turban bans with FIFA and then FIBA. And at that time, for something, when you think about exclusion, a deliberate exclusion from specific groups in sport, there was a lot of mobilization that happened within the sport, because although I write very much on Muslim women in sport, so many of the struggles of other communities were linked. For example, when turbans were banned by FIFA and by FIBA, it wasn't just a singular issue in a community that affected Muslims. It affected Sikh men, it affected Jewish men, it affected Muslim women, and many others. So I think that kind of led me on a path down to think about what other communities and marginalized communities were doing. I have written about a variety of things, the intersections of racism and misogyny in sport. It's like a really fun beat sometimes, but it needs to be done. And I often liken the Canadian media landscape to a mayonnaise factory. And I'm just like the sriracha sauce in that mayonnaise factory, I guess you could say, because sometimes you need to shake things up. And but essentially, I'm really grateful for places and sports organizations and teams. And I do consultancy work as well to try to help people understand and look at things from an anti-oppression and far more inclusion-based level, whether it's practice or whether it's implementation or broadening their base of athletes or, whatever it may be. And I think at the end of the day, much like Patrick and Inderpal, I'm very much an optimist and think that sports can do many wonderful things in that way. And I think I'm excited to be here this evening.
Great. Yeah, those are definitely some interesting stories for sure. And we'll dive into each one of them as the hour goes on. But as we all know, racism, it isn't necessarily a recent phenomenon by any means. Canada itself has been rooted in colonialism since its inception, and we're still struggling today, hence why we're having this conversation right now. And I wonder, when all of you guys were navigating your paths, were you guys aware of the treatment that you were receiving? And was it difficult to obtain certain opportunities in comparison to your teammates who didn't necessarily look like you? And perhaps we can start off with Shireen again, I guess, since you're right here.
Yeah, I mean, there was no way that I grew up in Halifax in the 80s, not to age myself, but yeah, I'm a child of the 80s, and nobody looked like me. And I guess there's a part of you when you're a child, and I can only speak from my own experience, that you don't think about systems, you don't think about the way things work and governance necessarily, you think about what's happening to you. So for example, and I'll be very frank here, the first time I ever experienced racialized abuse was on the pitch. And I was, called a slur, and one that's attributed to South Asian diasporic folks. And I reacted in a way as an 11-year-old that was visceral, but I punched the goalkeeper because I'm a forward who said this to me. But unfortunately, nobody saw or heard her say that to me. The only thing that everybody witnessed was me reacting. So I'm an 11-year-old and I got suspended for 2 games and I got a red card. My coach was furious because I basically cost us that match, which affected our standings. And nobody knew how to deal with it. So not only am I looking at myself going, I was made to feel as if I was the problem. Nobody asked, not to necessarily excuse that behavior or that reaction, but to also look back and think, well, wait a minute, what led to that? And those are the questions we need to be asking. How did this happen? Why did it happen? What is the root of it? And very much in sports, I think that we tend to do Band-Aid solutions to temporarily fix a problem without looking at a root cause. So I definitely felt othered and not in wonderful ways.
Yeah, and what about you, Indy?
Well, maybe first, if I could just be really honest to everybody who's on this call. I had a real concern about being on this call, on this panel, because I was really worried that people would watch this and maybe think that this is the playbook on how to deal with all people who are of Indian heritage who are playing sport or playing hockey. There's a very strong population of people who play hockey in this country who are of Indian heritage. And so the first thing I want to just acknowledge is that this was my experience and this is what I went through. And it's, there's no best practices here. Maybe there's principles that we're working on around respect, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody knows that, when I communicate to everyone, I'm just talking about my experience as a person who's of Indian heritage. So Grace, your question was around opportunities that were lost. I'm not sure of, I never know what the opportunities that were lost. I'm not sure what was lost. I can only really talk about what I went through, because the things that are lost are unknown to me. I'm not sure of those experiences. There's quite a few people of Indian heritage that do play. We do have opportunities to play in this country. I think maybe what was lost was opportunities to really be seen as a Canadian. And I'll give you an example. I'm a national team coach, and when I go to another country, we went to the World Cup, and the first thing people said to me was, your team, is this even a Canadian team? Because we have a really mixed heritage team. And with pride, I was able to say, yes, this is what Canadians look like. But then I come back to Canada and people don't think I'm a Canadian. I've born in Canada, represent Canada in multiple games, but I'm never Canadian enough to be a Canadian athlete, Canadian coach, Canadian mentor. That's pretty hurtful. I sometimes wonder what I need to do more of to be more Canadian. How do I represent being Canadian? Is it coming to this country, getting a passport, not Canadian enough? Is it, do you need to change your religion? Do you need to cut your hair? Do you need to lose all your other beliefs to be more Canadian? And so I think to me, it's not about what I've lost. It's about, being accepted as as a Canadian sports person. And I think that's the one thing I've never been able to achieve. That when I'm in a sporting environment, when I go to a coaching conference, when I go to an international event, when I'm here at home, I'm still considered a part of the Indian hockey community. I always wonder when I'll be considered to be a part of the Canadian hockey community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's completely fair, and I'm happy you brought that up and shared it with us. Patrick, yourself, have you noticed anything within the treatment that you've been receiving, or was it difficult growing up in South Africa and playing and being in hockey?
Yeah, so I will base my conversation again around myself, and I'll base it based on my upbringing in South Africa. I can't really make comments based on my experience in Canada right now. But I mean, growing up again, you know, if I take a leaf out of Indy's messaging there, you know, of opportunities lost, I think I had a lot of opportunities. But my mom definitely had opportunities lost due to racism. And if you look at South Africa in terms of apartheid, it was quite rife, and it started in 1948, where you know, there was massive segregation. You know, so people couldn't mix together. So basically, when I say people, you know, black, white, there was a divide there. So those communities couldn't mix, and those opportunities were lost in terms of, you know, my mom getting a good education, you know, being able to attend a good school, to make sure that she could care for us, you know, and really provide well for us financially. But not to say that she didn't provide for us, but I mean, I think those opportunities were lost. She definitely provided for us, and gave me the opportunity to make sure that I had the chance to make sure that I had a really good education, and to make sure that I could really excel going forward. So when I look at it, when I look at race in South Africa, it's clear, it's black and white, you know, and it's there, and there's no use hiding it. Okay, it's something that we can't hide. We need, it's there, and we need to change it, you know, and we as human beings can change it. So I think for me, when I look back, definitely lots of opportunities for me. But yeah, when you still look back, racism is still rife, eh? And I think this platform is a great opportunity to look to sort of communicate that, and see how we can work through this.
Mm. Yeah, and Patrick, just building off the fact that you come from South Africa, a country rooted in racism, and that you mentioned has generally been very divided. How has that affected who you are today and the way that you coach?
Yeah, I think for me as an individual, I have a lot of pride. So, you know, in these opportunities where there is racism and you get appointed in certain positions, and I learned this from an individual who said, Patrick, you know, every day you must make sure that it's your CV. So the way you conduct yourself, the way you execute your work, make sure that you do it of high quality and high standard. And again, I'll give you an example between a black coach and a white coach. You know, so if I'm a black coach, I want to make sure that, hey, I'm being the best product for the athletes, and I got to make sure that, hey, I am well qualified, and that the athletes can believe in my coaching abilities, because I need to work twice as hard to make sure to prove to them that, hey, listen, I'm good enough. I'm not here based on the color of my skin, where it might be slightly different in certain areas if, let's say, it was a different coach. So I think for me, it's always put pride in terms of the way I do things, and I've always put that pressure on myself to make sure that I excel exceptionally well, that no finger can ever be pointed in the quality of work that one does. So I try to take away the race part, to make sure, hey, you judge me on my quality, not on the color of my skin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I 100% agree. And when we talk about racism and discrimination, stereotypes often play a huge role in perpetrating these outdated mindsets that we have. So, Indy, you mentioned that you were somebody who's born in Canada, who's grown up here all your life, yet people have these preconceived ideas about who you are and your background. How do you necessarily deal with it, both on the pitch and off?
Well, the key is that I don't have to deal with it, that someone else does, right? They really have to get to really know me. And the challenge is that when people see me from a distance, the first thing they do is judge me. I get judged at coaching conferences. There's very few people of color at those. If you've ever gone to any type of sport leadership opportunity, it's, there's not many people of color. And so for me dealing with it, like I said, I don't think I necessarily have to deal with it. I need to be truer to myself and be who I am. And it's really up to other people, and this is part of the allyship part, to be able to understand how to acknowledge people as individuals, not group, not generalize. And that's probably the biggest challenge that we have in this country. And maybe I'll just echo back to what Patrick just talked about. Patrick's talked about South Africa being rife with racism, and we can easily say the same thing of Canada. I don't think in no way can we say that, we're going to qualify whose racism was worse. Racism is there and it's present, and we need to acknowledge it and deal with it. And if we look at field hockey in this country, there's a reason why we have clubs that are of different ethnicities, is that we have clubs that are 80 years old, 100 years old. It's not because of choice, it's because they weren't welcome. So we build this two-tier system around which type of clubs we have. Ones that are for everyone, and then ones that are for some. And then over time, that permeates and permeates and permeates and leaves us where we are currently. It's not to say that people of a certain heritage cannot have their own club, but we need to acknowledge where that comes from in sport in this country. And it's not just hockey, soccer, there's tons of sports that are like this. And we see it as a point of pride. And I definitely see ethnicity and varieties of ethnicity as a point of pride, but let's acknowledge where it came from and why it happened in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yes, those are some great opinions. And as you mentioned, within the sports industry, we have these variations between leagues as well. So when we look at bigger leagues, we see the NBA and the WNBA, who are considered as setting an example for other leagues, and as well as the NWSL. What practices are they doing well compared to the NHL, who I wholeheartedly believe is terribly behind and has not kind of advanced the sport when it comes to being more diverse?
Initially, when you mentioned the NHL, I'm like, is this a setup? You want me to say bad things? Because I can. Yeah, if you want an example of what not to do, follow the NHL. I think that let's be really clear about something, it wasn't the NBA, it was the WNBA. It was Black women who led this fight. They shared the blueprint of how to do this. Let's just be very honest. With all due respect to the NBA, they followed the WNBA. I mean, the WNBA was protesting very soon after 2017. They were the first athletes in that sport to get fined for wearing T-shirts and that said, I can't breathe. And we need to remember that in history. And it's great. And the amplification of this was certainly increased by the NBA, but let's give these women their due. Now, in terms of what to go forward, different sports, like you mentioned, Grace, and WSL and the WNBA. The WNBA was the first major sports league to have a social justice council. Again, spearheaded by Black women. Spearheaded by queer voices. I mean, this is extremely important to understand and to realize where in the community everything fits in. And I think one of the biggest thing was letting people from those spaces and those racialized identities tell you what they need, as opposed to somebody, and very much I see with larger teams, and whether it's leagues or international governing bodies, the people at the heads of those tables are usually men with an enormous amount of privilege. And 99% of those, I mean, some international governing bodies don't even have a woman on their exec council. So they're making decisions about funding, they're making decisions about many things that actually don't affect them. And in my research and in my work over the last decade, I've come very strongly to believe that change won't be made unless those at the decision-making tables and those places are affected directly. And I mean, Indy just said something that really struck me, is that it's not his problem, it's someone else's problem. And I really like that it's, the onus is usually put on those to carry the burden and make the change. And I'm, for one, I put in the work. Like, for example, we're in a time in society where anti-Blackness is prevalent. So what can I do as a non-Black person of color to be able to shoulder some of that burden and figure it out, but also look to people with the most amount of privilege. And this is something in Canada that Canadian sport is very uncomfortable to say. Canadian sport is very uncomfortable talking about race. I'm going to just say it. Like, white people, you got to step up. You got to step up, because that's what needs to happen. And Canada itself prides itself on being multicultural, and it definitely is. I mean, my father moved here in the 60s, and, you know, he couldn't row in his hometown of Karachi because the rowing club would reject him, but he had a chance to row here. And that, you know, the sport gave him an in. My mother came to Canada and fell in love with the Montreal Canadiens. She did that here, and she found a community and she found people. But I think realistically, that doesn't mean that there are examples. And I appreciate what both Patrick and Indy said about they speak for themselves, and I very much do the same. You can't paint everything or solution with one broad brushstroke. But when you talk about allyship, whether it's giving money to communities, whether it's literally giving up your seat at the table, whether it's a board, whether it's a committee to say, what do you think? But without putting all the work on racialized people, on disabled folks that want inclusion, on queer communities that need to be heard. I think we need to be really conscious of this. And it's an unlearning. I like to call it an unlearning and a relearning. It can be very overwhelming. People don't like to hear the word privilege. It makes folks very defensive. They really get defensive about it. But it's not going to be easy, and it's not a sprint. It's a marathon. This is decades of work we're talking about, of like reestablishing systems. So I want to be very hopeful when I say that there will be joys. It is hard work. We can do it as a community, but people have to be collectively invested in this. I'm trying to be really positive and basically look to your leadership and question your leadership. I mean, we've seen the NHL implode in this issue. The HD, the Hockey Diversity Alliance, although I have questions about them and their lack of inclusion of women, they separated themselves from the NHL. Like, that's not a good look at all for anybody. So yeah, that's the takeaway there.
Yeah, I completely agree. And Shireen, I'm going to pick on you again and kind of discuss what you do. So your work is rooted in empowering BIPOC, women, Muslims, and other marginalized groups in sport. And I really want to bring out this concept of intersectionality, because with extra barriers for BIPOC individuals, I'm really curious to see how we can better support them, as we tend to marginalize or isolate these marginalized groups. I've seen so many panels, and I'm guilty of hosting one now, that is focused solely on racism in sports or women in sports, but never these multiple groups together. So what conversations can we have to include more people without neglecting certain important aspects? And of course, let's talk about intersectionality.
Well, I mean, I think just understanding intersectionality is looking at things from different experiences of different communities that don't have power, and understanding power dynamics. Like, but if you were going to host, Grace, a panel on racism and have all white people, I would be texting you furiously. So who you have on this panel is important, particularly representing the sport in this place. So I think that having people from different communities with the leadership skills, like, and with the experience within the sport is crucial, and this is a good start. But also, I think the biggest part of these panels, and I've done so many of them, is the follow-up. Like, what happens after? Like, are we going to check in 6 months and see? I mean, this is particularly an association, Field Hockey Canada, that is strongly associated, obviously, with Indy and Patrick. So I don't doubt that there will be, and you, like Field Hockey Canada. I'm not one to give out cookies unnecessarily, but you're one of the first sports organizations that's doing this type of work. And I think that needs to be recognized also, that this country really lacks. And I really appreciate what Indy said. I mean, Canada literally is founded on genocide. So we don't get to pat ourselves on the back here. So, I mean, it's coming slowly, but at least it's coming in from this corner.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And the second half of the session kind of speaks to effective allyship. And truth be told, it's such a broad term, especially when we break it apart and we actually look at what it means to be supportive and an effective ally. And my question to all of you guys is, how would you describe an ally in your own words? Patrick, perhaps we can start with you.
Okay, so I mean, English is not my first language, so I went and looked at what allyship sort of means, a dictionary meaning, just so I could get a bit of a better idea. And the dictionary meaning talks a little bit about lifelong, process of building relationships. It talks about trust, consistency and accountability. So when I look at in terms of the line of work that I work in, when we talk a little bit about building relationships, and let's take hockey for instance, it's about building greater relationships within our community and also getting myself out into the community, okay, and making sure that we can also promote the sport of field hockey into the communities that necessarily might not know what field hockey is about. I think that's a start. And then I think it's also understanding that community and that environment as well. I think it's important to understand the people that work or live in that environment. And once you get to understand that environment, it's easy then to communicate and also trust. Trust is also earned, but also our messaging when we communicate with people, information is perceived through feelings first. Once we start to perceive that through our feelings, then we start to build trust, and then with trust, then consistency starts to happen as well. So for me, when I look at Ally, I think it's important for us to make sure that we definitely get into the community and advise, but also show the possible means of moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yes, completely agree. Indy, what does an ally mean to you?
I think Patrick hit some really important terms there. I think the first thing is understanding what's happening around you and understanding what people in your environment are going through. I think the second part of it is to respect. And then the third part is acting on that and acting against the unjust. I think that's what I want to, that's when I think of an ally and I think of allyship, that's what I think of in terms of someone who is being an ally. And I was just thinking about, what's a great example of allyship that I've seen in my coaching time. And I'll maybe tell a story. I was coming back from Argentina on a tour, and I was coming through Austin, Texas, and got stopped. I get stopped regularly, get stopped often, frequently. And I had a group of athletes with me that were coming through with me who understood what happened, stopped, stayed with me, and said, no, if you're going to check him, you're going to check me. You're going to check me. I had about 4 guys who were all with me who did that. And I thought to myself, those are people who understood what was happening, respected what was happening, and then acted on it to call out what was happening in the only way they could in terms of dealing with authority. And I thought to myself, that's my example of what it means to be an ally. Not to just be like, that was pretty bad what happened to you back there, which often happens. Do you remember when that happened? Oh man, are you okay? Are you okay is fine. But it's being able to step in, understand, and act. And shout out goes to Mark Pearson, who plays on the senior team right now. He probably doesn't remember, but he was the guy who did that for me. So
yeah, that's a great example, and we definitely need more people like Mark and the other players to step up and also help us in those situations of need. Shireen, what about you?
Yeah, I think that story is really important. And one of the key things that hit me when Indy was speaking was that Mark might not remember that, but Indy does. And that's very much if we're going to use really quick anecdotes, one of the first, or maybe the most important investigative pieces I ever did never got picked up. So I just published it on my blog. It was maybe about 6 or 7 years ago. This young woman in Colorado wasn't allowed to play in her high school varsity soccer match because she was wearing a headscarf. So then her whole team decided to wear a headscarf and they took a photo. And I was like, oh, okay. And everyone, it was posted everywhere, Upworthy, it was posted, you name it, those feel-good sites. But I'm like, okay, wait a minute. So they took a photo, then what happened? So apparently what happened is they all took a photo, they posted the photo, then they all took off their headscarves and went to go play and left her sitting on the bench. So what does that do for anybody again? And I don't expect 16 and 17-year-olds to have the answer, but I expect people to be able to guide them too. And so when I ended up calling the Colorado State High School Athletics Association, I found out, much to my own disappointment, that I was the first person to make a call and inquire. So, and this post had been shared hundreds of thousands of times all over the interwebs. It was everywhere, and Tumblr and Twitter and whatnot. And I was like, but not a single person thought to call and ask the school or ask the high school association about their unfair rules. Like, there needs to be follow-up. And this is what I'm saying. Like, I'm part of organizations that say, give us money and get out of the way, which is one way to do things. One solution is to support like businesses and to find out, to amplify people that need their campaigns amplified, to give your time to volunteer if you don't necessarily have money. Time is also very valuable. People's time is very important. It's one of the key things that works in these spaces, because people that often do anti-oppression work, we don't do it for the money. Let me tell you, there's not a lot, right? You don't do it for the fame. You do it because you feel it needs to be done. So donate your time. Like, there's things that people can do, and allyship is someone that'll pass the mic and sit down. Like, I realize I have education and language privilege. I come from a stable economic background. This is privilege. And like, what am I doing for people that don't have that? And, you know, someone would look at me and say, oh, poor thing, but it doesn't work like that. I think we all need to look at ourselves, and we're like, people like to punch down quite often. And it's not a comparison. Like, and very often communities are pitted against each other. And I think that's really dangerous, in order to like see what we can do, see as we can go forward. And I'm speaking from within racialized communities now, but like to look outwards as well. And for people that are looking in, most importantly, as an ally, ask them what they need. Don't come in there. Nobody needs a white savior. Don't come in and think you know how to fix something. So come in and ask the people that you want to actually assist what they need. That's the first place to start.
Yes. And although we mentioned different ways of how to approach this, BIPOC people are typically silenced because they're usually less likely to speak up because of possible repercussions that white counterparts don't have. Not everybody can step in and kind of take the bullet for others. So anyone who wants to answer this question, what do you have to say to that? Is there any advice you want to give, I guess, allies who want to do the work but are afraid of what might come?
Maybe just a question of why you're doing this, right? Like, you do it because you care about people, and you see things that are unjust, you know. There's people you care about that are people of color and people in your community. If I take us back to a coaching situation, you know, you have athletes, whether they're younger or older, that you care about. That's like the first part of coaching is safety and care for your people. And so if you're not prepared to care for them at the base level of their humanity, how are you going to teach them about a sport and teach them to love the game? And if you only see them as, you know, a player on your team, you're never going to reach that person. You know, we're not coaching hockey players, we're coaching human beings. We're not coaching technical skills, we're coaching to the soul of that person. And that's really what you're doing when you're an educator and you're a coach. So for me, I just would just say, you know, why are you doing it? It's not, you know, you're doing it because of care.
Mm-hmm.
I'll touch up on Indy's point as well, in terms of, you know, we coach human beings, you know, it's not athletes. So, you know, a quote that I like to use is that, you know, when you speak to someone in a language, okay, that it normally goes to their head. But if you talk to them in their language, okay, it goes to the heart, and they start to understand that, hey, I actually care about the individual. You know, going back to South Africa, you know, in my culture, normally we would sit, and a coach is normally someone that is older. So if I'm a youngster, I'm probably not going to question the coach, because it's in my culture, it's seen wrong to question, and I think it's important as we move on with the years that we're in now, that it's right to ask questions, to speak up, and to demand answers in terms of asking questions. Hey, what is the environment looking like? So I think, you know, for people, I think people must feel comfortable and must step up and ask questions, and don't feel that you're going to be segregated if you ask critical questions. I think it's important. I think if I, as a coach, and a player asks me critical questions and then I ignore those, then I am not doing due diligence to that individual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Patrick and Indy, you two are both coaches in the hockey community. And when you work with some of the senior teams and even some of the clubs that you train alongside, they're generally, I find, less diverse than other groups. Why do you think BIPOC individuals aren't properly represented at the top when you see increased engagement at the grassroots from these groups?
I'll jump in there on this one. At the next gen level and at the U21 level, I think we have a fair, and I can only speak to my experience on the men's team. There is a fair amount of diversity. At our last Junior World Cup, we had 13 of 18 athletes that were athletes of color and mixed ethnicity on our men's team. I think what happens after that to get to a senior team, that's where we need to look at things like, stereotyping. We need to look at things around style of play. There's terms that are used that aren't overtly racist that refer to what someone does and who they are. And I also think there's systemic things that that go beyond what happens on the field. You need to look at policies around levies and funding, where trainings are, what's the ease of for athletes. Is it easier for a certain group of athlete than another group of athlete? Like those things all come into play. What I might take it back to is let's go back to athletes of color and when their family first came to this country. If your family came to this country in the 60s and 50s, like my parents did, and their first experience was, not only are you not allowed to play, but you're not allowed to play and play with others. How is that going to trickle down into the mindset of the next group of athletes and the next generation of athletes around affirming their belief that they can play? And that's what our national team should look like. And I think we're lucky in field hockey. We've had a lot of great athletes of color. And I think we're fortunate in terms of our sport, in terms of some of the diversity that we've had. But I just think about how that impact initially still hurts athletes in terms of what they really think they can achieve. So yeah, I think I probably have those 2 points around just things around policy and systemic stuff, and that that initial feeling that athletes and families have had since they first came to Canada.
And Patrick, anything on the topic that you want to add?
Yeah, I could add, and I'll take it to a South African context because I probably have more understanding there than the Canadian context in terms of the diversity within the team. And if I look at back in South Africa, if you look at people of color playing hockey, okay, it is now more prevalent now because there's more opportunities given. And those opportunities are given because there's lots of grass work that is being done now in terms of educating and showing them, hey, there's pathways. He has a different sport. Yeah, he has the opportunity to actually grow, and we can use hockey as an avenue for you to get into a university to get a really good education, and then from there you can also then play in your national team. And again, it's about grassroots. You spoke a little bit about grassroots level. I think that's critical. For instance, if you look at sort of South Africa in terms of where most Black Africans are situated, and not to say some of them are not in affluent regions, but if you look at South Africa, 60 million people, most Black Africans stay in sort of impoverished areas, sort of like we call them townships, where you're not really going to put in an astroturf, which is going to cost you millions and millions of dollars or rands, for instance. And put it out there because some of these athletes are living in harsh conditions. So you got to look at how can you motivate and how can you educate, how can you show them pathways by doing the grassroots work in terms of showing them and then moving them out of that environment, but also showing them the pathway going forward. And then Indy touched up a little bit on the financial means as well. So we all know hockey is an expensive sport. Some people also want to get a good education and become well off in terms of their studies, and then be able to provide for their households. So I think that's also a critical piece that we also got to look at as well. So we also got to make the sport accessible,
For sure. So Shireen, so let's talk a bit about the social media side. I've seen people become very reactive when people don't understand why we highlight particular details. So for example, Stephanie Frappart's being the first female referee to officiate a men's Champions League game today. That was so historical. And I've read the comments and people are just mean. So do you think it's possible to have sports without the so-called political side? Or blatantly speaking, these are human justice issues?
Yeah, I have a problem with people saying don't politicize sport. Like for me personally, everything I've done can be politicized. My entire identity can't be divorced from who I am when I'm in this, like engaging in sports. It doesn't work that way. And I mean, this idea of don't politicize sports comes from people that don't want to be inconvenienced with the issues of justice. They've never had to deal with systemic issues of injustice, so they don't want to deal with it. They just want their Sunday. They don't want to see Sarah Fuller kicking for Vanderbilt. They don't want to deal with any of that. And I think there's something to be said about holding joy. I mean, 2020 has been a rough year. So like, I think that, you know, holding space for places and although I have concerns about the Champs League, I have concerns about the way the NCAA is holding, and it doesn't, you know, how it uses brown and black bodies and doesn't pay them and exploits the athletes. I have questions about all of this, but I also know that a girl was able to kick, who's the goalkeeper for her, the women's team at Vanderbilt University, was able to go and do something and maybe open a space, maybe open a door for somebody. And I think that's important, and there's reasons to celebrate. And that I've learned from, you know, my elders, that don't tire yourself out, like hold space for happiness. And for me, sports has a lot of it, holds a lot of happiness. Well, I guess not, because I'm a long suffering Arsenal fan, but normally I'd hold happiness, right? And I think it's important to really appreciate that. And as far as the social media comments go, I can't do, like, I don't have time for shenanigans. I really don't. And the great South African runner, Caster Semenya, said, I don't have time for this nonsense. And I agree. I just don't have time for this nonsense. I'm here to do what I need to do. You can sit in your basement or wherever you are, or your boardroom, and be tweeting at me like that, or like something that's the opposite of a nicety. But will it stop me? No. And the one thing that we need to do, and I really want to be careful how I say this, is that I think there's an assumption that people who are racist or discriminatory or prejudiced come from a specific background. And that comes a lot from a lens in the United States. And we need to be really careful. Oh, they're uneducated, or they're this, or they're that, or they're poor. Injustice happens at every scope. It's in boardrooms, it's in elite places, it's in high-level coaching. We have to be really careful how we assume that people, you know, and I'm not saying be suspicious of everybody, but just not compartmentalize in a way that doesn't let us truly be honest and transparent about the problem. And when you talk about social media and you talk about back and forth, if someone wants to reach out to me and say, listen, you've done something wrong, and there's a lot of having to put your egos aside. Like very recently, I was corrected on something I said that was ableist. And somebody from the disabled community said, I'm sorry, that's wrong. And you acknowledge, and you do better. You apologize, definitely. And then you do better. And how could I have done this differently? Like, I'm very grateful to people in the non-binary community who have taught me a whole lot, but that's what it is. It's about education at the same time. If someone doesn't know a lot, I mean, the question I get the most is, did your father force you to wear it? My headscarf. It's the most common question I get. I'm like, I know, because I didn't actually have a conversation with him about it. I just did it. But that's my experience, right? So, I mean, I think education and helping people understand things is really key here as well. But the one thing I will say to those who are racialized, who are listening, is, you know this, so put your own mask on first. Take care of yourself, because this work is exhausting and it's not going to end anytime soon. That's not me being negative. This is just being realistic. So take care of yourself in whatever way you need to. Right? Like, decompress your self-care. My self-care happens to be Bend It Like Beckham, but that's what I do. That film for me is everything. So take what you need, get what you need, and keep going.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and thankfully this year in 2020, there seems to be almost like an inability to turn away from what communities have been facing following the murder of George Floyd. We know these aren't isolated incidents, and these are disturbing patterns committed against people of color. And on that note, we're going to move on to the final question of the night before we move on to audience questions. But in your experience and in your own opinion, how do you say we keep this momentum going while also trying not to traumatize our BIPOC colleagues? Andy, let's start.
Yeah, maybe I'll take it down to the field hockey level, and I'll take it back to your local area. And I'll start with, are you ready for this? Like, are you really ready to accept everyone and really have them be successful and succeed in our community? I think every field hockey person I talk to says they absolutely love the game. They're passionate about it. And they always say, I wish more kids would play. I wish more people would play. But are we really ready for that? Are we ready for, in our club, to advertise to everyone, people of color, indigenous people, Black, brown? Are people, in the binary community, are we really prepared to involve everyone? Because when we are prepared to involve everyone at that level, then we're going to start making decisions that don't revolve around an 8-block radius around a field hockey field. We're going to make decisions that allow more people to play. And when people are inclusive, more people will be involved in this game. And I heard the other day, people saying, well, that works at club level, but when you move up into excellence, it's kill or be killed in excellence. It's either you're good or you're not. And for me, it's not a question of equality or equity and excellence. Equity unlocks excellence. We can't be the best hockey nation. You can't be the best club. You can't be the best you're going to be until we really get equity for all of our athletes in this country and those people that we work with. So for me, I think if I take it back to the base level, every day, for us in our communities, as a coach, as a community member, as a club member, as an athlete, are you prepared to accept everyone? And if you are, what are the next steps that go with that? How do your policies, the things that you do every single day, really demonstrate that you're prepared to really not only say it, but act it out?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Patrick, anything to add to that?
No, not really. I think Indy summed it up quite well. It's about creating opportunity, and we got to look at ourselves. Hey, what opportunities are we providing? And then can we support these opportunities, and can we take you to that level? That's all I can add to it. And can we provide opportunities? That's critical.
Yeah. And Shireen, any last tidbits about keeping the momentum going?
I'll just go back to reiterate, like, take care of yourself in this process. It's a long one. And, just so much respect and gratitude to other communities that are reaching out. And despite this time of trauma, for so many people that are continuing to help and show up, they're really pulling up for other communities and whatever their struggle is. And I mean, I, for one, have benefited from learning and being patiently taught. So, and I mean, Indy and Patrick are dropping gems. Indy said something like equity unlocks excellence. And I will be quoting him on that, because that's one hell of a line and something that I think people really need to think about, like within the realm of sport and beyond.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. So we can go on and talk about this topic for the rest of the evening and also into tomorrow, but I'll end it there. So thank you so much again to our wonderful panelists. And if anyone has any questions, please, like my colleague Haley mentioned, leave them in the chat box and we can start our open Q&A. We would love questions, agreed. So Haley says, as a sport leader, what actions can I start to implement tomorrow to become a better ally? So maybe let's talk about this in more tangible terms. Does anyone have anything to start off with?
I think it might depend on where, if she maybe can give us a little bit of an idea of where she's positioned as a sport ally. If she's looking for like so if she's a coach or a community, and then we can give her maybe an example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Haley, maybe you can follow up on that question. And in the meantime, Kevin says, the people on this call are here to learn. How do we reach people who don't know where to start, or worse, the ones that are ignoring these issues?
Can I go back? And I just was looking at Haley's question again, and if that's okay. One of the things that's really can be super helpful is to mentor. I think mentorship, and particularly in my industry in sports media, I mean, 90%, 95% in Canada rather, of sports media editorial and senior positions are white, able-bodied, cishet men. So if you can actually get someone from a BIPOC community and mentor them, like a young student and aspiring somebody. So like Indy and Patrick, absolutely, I'm sure you mentor many people. I mean, I'm sure you do, knowing and unknowingly. But for other folks out there, if you're interested, mentorship is a great way, because very often sport tends to be an access industry, and you get in for people you know. And just in the beginning of the conversation, Grace asked us about opportunity. In sport, I've seen it's very much of this friend of this child of this friend of this person gets this job. They get brought in that way. That's very much how this works. And I know this buddy, we used to play together back in university or in high school, and that's how things come in. Not to say those people aren't necessarily qualified for that role, but it just doesn't open it up. So think about when you're hiring, think about opening things up, think about looking beyond your own inner circle. That's would be very helpful as well.
Mm-hmm.
Grace, if I could add to that, I was just going to say that as a coach in Canada, I might be an anomaly, but since the age of 6, I've had a coach that has been of color and a Caucasian coach kind of combined in every year since I was the age of 6. I've had an example of BIPOC coaches throughout. And as a national team coach, I mean, we can go to Shiv Jagde taking a team to the Olympics and Junior World Cup. We can go to Shiaz Verji, Luis Mendonça. I have examples that are who've coached at the highest levels. And for me, I mean, they're definitely people to aspire to. And I just wanted to echo what Shireen said. You know, sometimes you don't know how powerful you are. Just who you are and being you is powerful enough to inspire. Because those you inspire, you don't see them. They see you.
Mm-hmm. I totally feel like you're an anomaly. I'm like, that's wild that you had, and it's so powerful that you had that. Because I mean, I have a daughter who played very competitive soccer her whole life, and she only had her first Black coach was this past in her final year of high school. And otherwise it was just not diverse. It also depends, of course, where you are. But I think that same thing. I mean, Indy, I think that's fantastic.
Great. So Chrissy asks, do you have advice for organizations who are starting equity, diversity, and inclusion working groups / committees? That's a tough one to start with, but Indy.
I think Shireen did a great job answering that earlier, just about, you know, bringing everybody to the table to have the conversation to start and being open and honest and fearless in your conversation. That's all, you know, this is what we're doing right now. We're sitting here with 50 people on this call, having an open and honest conversation, and no one's holding back. And it's going to hurt. And, you know, obviously we've got some people muted here and stuff, but it could hurt, and it could hurt for a while, but once you deal with that pain and some of that hurt and some deep seated stuff, the only place you can move is forward, because at least everyone's in the room. What's worse is when you have the situations where not everyone's in the room and people are stewing in the background. You're always going to be met with, something that's going to stop you from moving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also just to cover like some of these questions, pushing your organization to have these conversations is especially important. Having this as a topic in a workshop for one of your conferences, like, by all means push it, even though you feel like no one might support you, because you'll have these good opportunities that come as a result of it. So even if you're just one small person and you recently just got this job a few months ago, try and make events that you want to see. Push for initiatives that you want to be a part of, and things will come out of that. Okay, so I'm wondering if you had a conversation about diversity within your own teams. How are these conversations received?
I'll do this one because I've got a pretty diverse team. We have these conversations all the time. And as a player, what I used to hate is when the coach would say, hey, why are all the brown guys in the same group together? This happened all the time, all the way up until the highest levels. Hey, we can't have all the brown guys together. I used to hate that stuff. And I said to myself, when I become a coach, I want to make sure that I deal with those situations in a much more different way. And I think my group in 2016 that I had, that was a daily conversation with us about how we interacted together and how we interacted as a group. Athletes choose who they want to be with, and when you get othered like that, it's like the brown kid's fault for being together, but the other 9 guys on the team are the team, and then you're the brown kids on the team. And those types of conversations are those types of incidents really, really hurt, and they stick with you. They other you right away. I mentioned it earlier. I'm an Indian hockey coach in Canada, but I'm born in Canada. It just makes you feel more and more like that. So I think you can have that open on conversation with your kids, because they're probably more prepared for it than you are. Really, like the kids now, they're more willing to have that conversation. Like, why is it like that? Okay, we need to deal with that relationship between our team. Yeah, we need to talk about that. We need to get closer together, not further apart.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Justin says he's just begun the conversation at the team level where he's directly involved. However, what do you do when your organization is not supportive of changing the culture?
Get on the board of directors.
Yeah, maybe I'll tackle it. I think first and foremost, it's critical to have these discussions. You also, when you apply for a job, when when you apply for a job, you want to be in a working environment that respects you as an individual, but also respects the individuals working in that environment, and that they have a long-term plan in terms of being inclusive, and also making sure that you are growing as an individual. So I think it's critical to ask these questions and push those because you want to grow as an individual, but it's also relevant to the current society that we live in. And if we turn blinkers and we put blinkers on and we don't want to move forward, it becomes very difficult, and we will just continue to stagnate. And I mean, if I take a quote here, Nelson Mandela said, no person is born hating an individual, due to the color of their skin or their background or religion. Okay, we as individuals can change that. Okay, and it takes you to make that change, to say, hey, I don't like this. This is what I would like to see us as an organization going forward. Are we having these critical conversations? Okay, and that's the only way you move forward, when you have these difficult, uncomfortable conversations, to then move forward from there.
Mm-hmm. 100% agreed. And we'll take our final question of the night. So as a teenager, do you have any advice to help me increase my knowledge in supporting my fellow peers? So maybe we can do a rapid round of resources that we can each access, and we'll go around the table. So Indy, let's start with you.
Sorry, Grace, can you just repeat that? My headphones cut out there.
So any resources you have to help people increase their knowledge on supporting their peers?
I think the resources are all kind of inside of you, like as Canadians, we're just such and like I said, I'm really fortunate to be in Canada. I'm fortunate to have the opportunities that I've been afforded. And I really think in like deep in my heart, there's a reason I'm so, like, I have such pride for this country, is the fact that I know the people in this country, and everyone is innately good. And we know when things aren't going right. We know, we can feel it in our heart. And sometimes we're just not sure how to act, or we don't know when to act. It takes bravery and it takes courage. And I think those are the places you need to start, is your own personal bravery and courage to call out the things that you know are incorrect and wrong, that aren't treating people, you know, in a equitable manner.
Mm-hmm.
So it's maybe a bit of soul searching.
Yes, agreed. Shireen?
Yeah, one of the things that has really been pivotal in my life is language and usage of language. And just getting back to Chrissy's point, hey, Chrissy, is very much, I'm a big proponent of anti-oppression training. And just because you think you're a good person, or said person is a good guy, that doesn't mean that they can't be complicit in systems of racism or sexism. Like, to Indy's point, like, sure, we want to be positive and think that everyone's a good guy and they're kind, but I don't want kindness. I want anti-racism. I want anti-homophobia. I don't want ableism. I don't want people to be transphobic. So there's a way, and Canada's mastered it, on how to be polite, but still be super racist and be problematic. So I would ask that people take that really seriously. For an organization, maybe forgo your office party. I don't know if anyone's in offices anymore, but put that money towards anti-oppression training. There are people who are liberation educators out there. Hire them to come to talk to you, to teach you. They're people who actually do this work. Don't expect it for free, is what I'm saying. There are people who, I don't do individual training sessions as such. I mostly work with organizations and things, but ask and we'll help you find it. There's definitely people all over the country doing this type of work, and language is key. And I mean, reading outside of what you think, and just to hear Indy and Patrick speak about their experiences, they're very much Canadian. Whether or not you're born here is irrelevant. I mean, borders are man-made anyway. So yeah, don't put away your unconscious, try to understand your unconscious biases and then put them away. Because I mean, quite frankly, Indy is like, just depending on, and unless he tells me he's a Canucks fan, which I think you are. You're a Canucks fan? Yeah, I figured. It's okay, Braden Holtby's there now, you're fine. So I mean, like, what does it even mean to be Canadian? I mean, think about it. What does that even mean? What are we saying here? So I often felt not Canadian enough, but just like, we need to lose that rhetoric. We need to get rid of it. Because for me, Indy, Patrick, and you, Grace, are what Canada is.
I love that. Patrick, any last tips, advice? No?
No, I think you summed it up, perfectly, and I think, again, it's okay to feel vulnerable, and it's okay to ask and to seek help. There's nothing wrong with that. I think sometimes we feel afraid and we think, well, if I'm vulnerable, it's a sign of weakness. No, it's not. It's a sign of understanding yourself first, and then what you need to make sure that you can be a great individual. So I think that's important, that we must be brave. And I think we spoke about be brave, but also be vulnerable. Be vulnerable and say, hey, I'm struggling with X, Y, Z, and this is what I need to make sure that, hey, I understand racism and I want to change, or this is what I need to do for myself to be a better person. And I think that's important. We must acknowledge that. Okay, without acknowledging it, we just sugarcoating it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, those are some good points. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have left today. Again, I want to say a huge thank you to Inderpal Sehmbi, Shireen Ahmed, and Patrick Tshutshani for this very insightful and necessary conversation. Haley will now send over an exit survey link in the chat should you guys have any feedback for us and the session. And we'll begin day 2 of the conference with our mental wellness workshop and fireside chat happening tomorrow at 12 p.m. Pacific and 3 p.m. Eastern. Again, thank you all for joining. And from all of us from Field Hockey Canada, we hope to see you again this week. Take care.